Welcome everybody. If you're here to talk about physical activity and well-being and how that all links into the leveling up agenda, then you are indeed in the right place. My name is Andrew Laird and I'm the Managing Director of Mutual Ventures. We're a small consultancy that specializes in public services. We want to make them better, bolder and more sustainable. And our particular interest in the discussion point today is that we're working with a wide range of councils who are developing both leveling up bids and shared prosperity fund investment plans. And I'm going to say a little bit more about those. But if you're interested in either of those topics and want to know specifically about the processes, then we have a range of other webinars which are on the Mutual Ventures website, which you can access. We will touch on elements of both today, but there's a particular theme focus today, which is physical activity and well-being. This session's being recorded, so there's no need to try and record it yourself. We will share the link and we will also share any slides that we use. And you can submit questions using the Q&A function. And again, once Paul and I are done talking, we'll do our best to get to as many of those as possible. So I really want to welcome my co-host today, Paul Cluett. Paul, would you like to introduce yourself?
Thanks, Andrew. Yes, I'm Paul Cluett, Managing Director at Alliance Leisure. As with Andrew, we're a fairly small business. We've been going about 24 years, working in the municipal leisure sector, where we work with clients to redevelop existing and aging, generally, leisure stock, building new build leisure facilities, and also working with our clients in how they maximize the utilization of those leisure centres through meaningful marketing and engagement with the customer base. So that's a little bit about us, Andrew, and I think you're going to cover off some groundwork now.
Thank you very much. So here's what we're going to go through. So we've done introductions, and I'm just going to say a few minutes, speak for a few minutes on the levelling up agenda and physical activity, well-being, how that all links, and indeed how physical activity and well-being links with other government policy agendas. Then Paul's going to talk to you about some of the work that Alliance Leisure has been doing. This is going to be about thinking strategically about physical activity and well-being. And then I'll take us on a quick canter through the various levelling up funds and how they fit with physical activity and well-being. And then we will take it from there. So just to give a quick introduction, I think most of the people on this webinar will realize the importance of physical activity and well-being, and it's critical to the levelling up agenda, both in terms of infrastructure projects and capital investment, but also in terms of programs. So if we take a few examples from the government agendas and government funds, you've got the Levelling Up Fund. We're currently working with Paul and the Alliance Leisure team in two areas to make levelling up bids, which are focused on leisure centres. So that's a real key element of the physical infrastructure bit of the Levelling Up Fund. But physical activity and well-being is also very key to the Shared Prosperity Fund. Now, the Shared Prosperity Fund differs from the Levelling Up Fund in one very key way. The Levelling Up Fund is very much about physical infrastructure and investment in physical things. The Shared Prosperity Fund is less about that, but more about people, more about programs, more about investing in people. So you've got those two sides of the coin, both which are very relevant to the wider levelling up agenda, and I think shows that physical activity and well-being runs through that entire agenda. But it's not just that agenda. If you think of the health and care reforms, so the whole integrated care system, integrated care partnership reforms, which are going on at the minute, physical activity and well-being are key elements of the wider determinants of health. So this is probably the most relevant area of discussion, which is a real bridge between the levelling up agenda and the health and care reforms, because actually they don't talk to each other that much and they're being implemented very separately. But in my view, physical activity and well-being are it is that key bridge across the two, and Paul and I will talk about that a bit more later. So Paul, I'm going to hand over to you now, and you can take us through some of your presentation.
Thanks, Andrew. I'm going to predominantly be talking about this through the sort of assets side of the leisure provision, the bricks and mortar. But just picking up on your point, Andrew, then about programs, as I've been doing my work for 25 years or whatever in the sector, there's loads of amazing schemes which actually will have some dotted lines. So schemes like sort of cycle schemes or community allotments, and actually just the sports clubs up and down the country, voluntary run very often, providing amazing services which link this whole physical activity, well-being agenda. But from my perspective today, I'll be talking more around the sort of asset side of it. I think one of the key things is that the leisure facilities have the ability to be a sort of cornerstone for so much more than just sport. And I'll talk a bit more about that in a moment. But the sector has this huge opportunity, really, that at the moment, depending on who you talk to, maybe 20-25% of the population are actively engaged in physical activity through facilities. So there's a huge amount of the population who aren't. The sites that we run in the sector typically are attracting 750,000, 1 million visits a year. So there's this massive footfall. So anything that we can plug into that has got a ready-made audience coming in, and we can spin away from that. As often as not, they're in prominent locations and generally with good access. So when we look at these elements on the left-hand side of that slide, what you're seeing is a number of types of activities or services that can be bolted on. And these are all ones that we're involved in delivering at the moment. There'll be lots more. So they can coexist with the traditional sport leisure function that's being delivered. The other factor which is really pertinent at the moment is that there is a massive black hole within the provision of leisure, and that is being driven by the aging leisure stock. And I'll talk a little bit about the carbon agenda a little bit later. But when you look at the aging stock, whether it's fit for purpose, whether it can provide these hub type activities, is an interesting dynamic, and we need to have a think about that. The other feature of leisure compared to a lot of what's done in the municipal sector, of course, is it can generate revenues on its own accord. Now, a lot of the things that we talk about is not dependent on LUF funding. So if we look at places like Warrington Livewire, where they've developed some amazing facilities with a strong link to health provision and GP practices, through to smaller projects. We delivered a project in Bradley Stoke in South Gloucestershire a couple of years ago, which was getting the library integration. So there's lots of examples of this which haven't been dependent on levelling up funding. But when you look at those elements, communities in place, supporting local businesses, people and skills, there's some very powerful links to what the government is trying to achieve through this, which can be delivered through the sort of health, well-being, physical activity space. I think one of the observations I've made when we're working with our clients in this space is identifying the local gaps which sit outside the normal sports leisure provision. So whether that's noticing that there's a lack of GP provision within a town, whether it's the fact that libraries perhaps are being delivered in a very different way now. They've become potentially much less library based, and actually how do you get books and ebooks into the community? And elements like local schools, local colleges, where they have roles which are growing and they've got a reducing stock of classroom space. How can we work with those organisations to bring all of this together so that what we're delivering is this hub which achieves on those objectives of the Levelling Up Fund? Could you move on a slide, Andrew? Apologies for a slightly boring slide here, but there's a really important message I wanted to get across, and that's the language. And when Andrew and I started talking a while ago now about this whole space, one of the things I was very keen to stress was that this adoption of the wording physical activity is really ever so important. And I look back, I was one of the founders of the Chartered Institute in our sector, and that involved bringing together the Institute of Sport and Recreation Management and the Institute of Leisure and Amenity Management. And those terms were sort of steeped in history around the old swimming bars and the slipper bars and all this sort of thing, and looking after parks. And when we wanted to bring it together as a Chartered Institute, one of the big conversations we had at the time, about 10 years ago, was the language. And it was recognizing that it is about physical activity, because it's only by bridging that you can actually start to engage with people who are not just talking about sport. So that language, it's a subtle point, but it's quite important. So I think what it does is it helps us bridge this gap into health, but it also provides for a wider agenda around getting a wider demographic involved. So a project we've delivered fairly recently in the Midlands, the fact that we were talking about physical activity made it much easier to engage with demographics who wouldn't traditionally use facilities. So we could have, and we designed the facility to accommodate things like female only swimming sessions, so that we could respect religious prerogatives and the like, so that getting this language right, talk about physical activity and how do we design our facilities to respect the agendas that delivers. Just whilst I've got the pictures up there, and I mentioned it earlier on, leisure centres, we all know that they are hungry on energy, and this has become a very big issue within the sector. The need to make sure that what we're doing is addressing the whole carbon emergency is really very, very important. And I think that when we're seeing increases in the realms of £20,000 to £50,000 a year additional cost linked to the provision of energy, from a commercial point of view, it's also really important, as well as from the climate emergency. And interestingly, the first passive house leisure facility has just been built down in Exeter, and we're looking at that with real interest to see what happens with that. It literally only opened in the last couple of months, but we're looking with real interest to see how that delivers against that carbon agenda. So having thought about the actual bricks and mortar, I just want to try and touch on a couple of bits about what the outcomes we want to achieve from this are. If you could just go on to the next slide, thanks, Andrew. This are some examples of some KPIs that we've developed for one of our clients, and I've just picked a couple of them to talk about a little bit. And I think before I do, this whole importance of physical activity and health is really incredibly important. There's so much data around this, around the contribution to reducing coronary heart disease, depression, stroke, type 2 diabetes, dementia. And interestingly, there's a report that we tend to look back on from the NHS about in 2020, I think it was, which talked about that regular participation in physical activity can reduce early death risk by about 30%, which is an incredible statistic, isn't it? So why do we want to look at the whole health and well-being? First of all, we want to get this healthier, living longer society where people can be more economically active, where they can live more fulfilled lives. And I think that when we look at that first KPI, just increasing the numbers, it isn't just about the bricks and mortar. And this is, again, playing to your point earlier, Andrew, around programs and what are we doing in the facilities to make sure that the program offers reflect the communities they want to be working in, and how we then take it across to this KPI number 7 there, the contribution to healthy life and increased life expectancy, which we think about that statistic of 30% earlier mortality with people who aren't physically active. It's quite a strong link there. Playing back to the levelling up objectives, this whole space around skills is really incredibly important. Again, when we think about a typical leisure facility with 40 to 60% of its costs being in the employment of staff, it gives you an idea as to why we need a skilled workforce there. And there's a lot of the traditional stuff there around customer services, the technical skills people need to run quite complex plant rooms, the administration, the management, the coaching. But right now, and playing to this agenda around the health and well-being space, there's a massive need for upskilling around the whole health delivery, whether that's working with people with chronic heart disease or diabetes management or weight management. So it's going to be a very interesting time. And I think the sector has a real opportunity to engage in the space around health. And it's a sector that was really quite badly affected during COVID. A lot of coaches are self-employed. So there's an opportunity, and just putting my institute hat back on for a second, the institute, funded through Sport England, is doing a re-engaged training package, which is really interesting because two of the pillars of that are around upskilling the sector to engage with inactive adults and to engage with the aging population. When we look back at those other KPIs we're trying to achieve here, upskilling the sector to be able to deliver that is going to be really important. If I just quickly touch on KPI 11, I've always thought the role of weight management and our sector really should be something like leaning on an open door. Again, looking back at that NHS report in 2020, at the time, 67% of men, 60% of women were obese. And the most frightening statistic from that, I think, 20% of year 6 children are obese, which gets even more frightening because it's twice as high in the areas of greatest deprivation. Now, why is that important to us? Well, traditionally, what we see is lower uptake of our leisure facilities in areas of deprivation. And so when there becomes a pressure to close facilities and you look at the levels of utilization, of course, those with the lowest utilization are the ones that very often get targeted. So linking that back to the comment earlier on about the aging stock, one of the moves we're seeing, and I think it's been reflected, Andrew, in a number of the projects we're looking at, is the co-location of sites. So where there's perhaps historically been 3 facilities, can we reduce it down to 2 better, more relevant facilities with this wider range of offer in better locations? So we've got some real opportunities to get our facilities in the right place, offering the right services to make a real difference around some of these really important issues. And that KPI 14 just really kind of brings it all together around getting communities to be more active, better skills. So I like that as a broader KPI. Just quickly, Andrew, I'll just go on to the next slide and just wrap up. I probably talked a bit too much, but I just thought it might be interesting. One of the questions we're always asked when you're looking at these KPIs is, yeah, that's great, but how do we know that what we're talking about is real? And we do some work with a practice called For Global, who developed this tool, the Data Hub, which is quite interesting. It's tracking about 21 million people's activities in the UK. And there's elements of it which you look at some of the stuff and the improved subjective well-being, which has a figure attached to it. So there's a degree of subjectivity to all of this. Of course there is, because it's impossible not to. But I think what's really interesting and what's very powerful when we're talking to the politicians is that actually this intervention, which historically the public sector has had to underwrite subsidies for provision of leisure facilities, but there is this wider economic benefit from it. And interestingly, if you just take that line of the improved health difference, this was a project we did, in fact we're involved in at the moment, which is redeveloping an existing facility. So that's why we've got some existing data on it. But the shift is about an increase of about 300,000 social value benefit just from the improved health element of that. And I think one of the challenges that we have within the sector, because that health benefit, of course, is effectively a quasi-saving to the health sector, but who funds the provision of the leisure facility? It's the local authority. So one of our challenges within the sector and the work that Andrew and I are doing with levelling up and other opportunities is, how do we get it so that we can get these silo mentalities changing, so we can say the saving from one sector, how can we draw that across into the other sector to fund the developments? So that's it for me for now. Andrew, thanks. You're on mute, Andrew.
That had to happen at one point, didn't it? Thank you, Paul. So what I'm going to do is say a little bit about the government's three main funds. So the first one is the Levelling Up Fund. The second is the UK Shared Prosperity Fund. And the third one that is slightly more niche is the Community Ownership Fund, but still quite critical to this agenda. So the Levelling Up Fund, apologies if you have already attended one of our webinars or know all about this, but just as a reminder, it is one of the key driving forces for the UK government's domestic agenda. It's designed to support regions, cities, towns, communities with physical and social infrastructure. So not just physical infrastructure, social infrastructure as well. It's a big fund, 4.8 billion, although the sort of numbers we see bandied around these days, 4.8 billion, maybe in government terms, isn't that much anymore, but it's still, there's still a lot can be done with it. The primary bidding entities are unitary councils, London boroughs, and district councils. So it doesn't channel through mayoral combined authorities or counties. The first round of bidding was completed last year. They handed out 1.7 billion of the 4.8. So still lots to play for. There's a current round underway. And if you want to put a bid in for that, you should be well underway by now. That the deadline for that is the 6th of July. And that's the deadline that Paul and I and our colleagues are aiming for with a number of our bids, which are to do with the physical activity facilities. And in terms of what the key themes are, there are three key themes. Transport, the relevance there, things like active travel, quite a few bids that we're involved in have elements of that. So better walking, better cycling, that type of thing. Regeneration and town centre investment is really where we hit this physical activity and well-being space. So this is the theme under which we're putting in bids for leisure centre refurbishments and regens and rebuilds, and so that's a very, very critical bit there. But it's also things like parks, other things that aren't leisure centres but are very focused on physical activity. And then the final theme, which is slightly less relevant unless it's particularly active culture, is cultural investment. If we move on to the UK Shared Prosperity Fund, so if you remember, I said that this one was more about people, less about physical infrastructure. So it is another key driver for the UK government's domestic agenda. The bidding entities here are slightly different. If you're in a mayoral combined authority area, then it's the MCA who will be making the bid. If you're in a single tier council elsewhere in the country that's not in an MCA, then you will be the main bidding entity. And then much like the Levelling Up Fund, it's the district councils within counties, not counties themselves by and large. It's a slightly smaller fund, it's 2.6 billion, and a key point here is that it's mostly revenue funding rather than capital. So that means it's to fund programs mostly rather than investment in physical infrastructure. But the revenue funding there, to take an example, might be if you're trying to run a physical activity program, you might have to invest in some kit, for instance. So the investment plan submission window for the UK Shared Prosperity Fund closes on the 1st of August. So the government, in their wisdom, have put the Levelling Up Fund bidding window and the window for developing Shared Prosperity Fund investment plans quite overlapping and very close together. So for a lot of you out there, this is a very, very busy June and July. The first payments from the Shared Prosperity Fund, much like what we expect from the Levelling Up Fund, will be around October, November this year. And the fund can support interventions that run from the 1st of April 2022 to March 2025. So in terms of the key themes that are within the UK Shared Prosperity Fund, it's three again. So the first one is communities in place. Second one is local businesses, and the third one is people and skills. And actually, the sort of things that Paul was talking about can touch on all three. And I'm going to show you exactly why, because helpfully the government have provided a list of 41 interventions that it suggested that you can choose from when you're allocating what you'll spend your UK shared prosperity funding on. So if we start with communities in place, there are three which I've picked out here. First one, really obvious one, funding for local sports facilities, tournament teams, leagues, to bring people together. That's an obvious one, I think, where if you want to run some programs around that, and you might even need a bit of capital investment. Then second one is investment in capacity building and infrastructure support for local civil society and community groups. Those local civil society and community groups could be focused on a physical activity, could be a walking group, anything like that. And then against each of these, there is the option to put in some funding for feasibility studies. So if you've got an idea, and the government are very clear on this actually, if you've got an idea about something, but you don't quite know if it'll work, or you're not sure how much exactly it will cost, you can put in some funding request for a feasibility study, and organizations like Paul's and mine are there to help with that. So the supporting businesses, that first one is there are a lot of words there, but supporting the decarbonisation, Paul's mentioned that. This is clearly a very big problem area for a lot of councils, that their leisure centres and physical activity locations do tend to pump out a lot of carbon. So this is quite key. So the investment in low carbon programs and things is really important here. This is not just around physical infrastructure, but changing behaviors as well. Then the next one is business support measures to drive employment growth, particularly in areas of higher unemployment. As Paul was saying, leisure and physical activity is a growing industry, and there are a lot of employment industries. It's the sort of thing that I could very well see a council investing in and actually starting to create really positive impact on the local economy. And then again, I've just highlighted the fact that if you've got an idea, but you haven't quite worked it up yet, you can include funding for a feasibility study. And then finally, under people and skills, employment support for economically inactive people. There's the option to provide wraparound support. So this could be getting people into the physical activity and well-being industry. And there is an intervention there which leads itself to that. So I think the UK Share Prosperity Fund, whilst you might not immediately think of this as an opportunity to do things around physical activity, it really is, I think. And then final one I was going to touch on is the Community Ownership Fund. So this was in the government's manifesto back in 2019, I think, and it's been talked about for quite a long time. There's quite a long history of from right back when Labour were in government through the coalition, and it's continuing, of encouraging staff who work in an organisation and people who use facilities to have the opportunity to actually take ownership. So this is another key driving force for that domestic agenda. And the whole point of this fund, it's a £150 million fund, so a lot smaller, but potentially having a large impact. And it's there to help communities take ownership of assets at risk of closure. So that's things like football grounds, post offices, that type of thing. In the first round, which was last year, they supported 39 projects and invested 10 million. So there's still the vast majority of that fund left. There was an investment in Bury Community Football Stadium, which was one of the larger ones. But I have to say, well, at least the category of investments with the most was probably community pubs. So not really linked to physical activity unless you're walking there and back, I suppose. We're around to the bidding windows open now, and it will close on the 19th of August. And an important part here is that it's match funding. So you can get match funding, but you've got to find some funding yourself. And also you need to be able to demonstrate in your bid that this is an asset that can really provide social value to a community. And you know, some of the examples there: community pubs, community post offices, the local community taking over a football stadium. I think that you can see that that is something which makes a lot of sense. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen so Paul and I can see each other. Don't forget to put any questions that you might have in the Q&A function, and we will get to those. But if we don't have too many questions, we will absolutely wrap up early and let people get about their business, because I know sitting in one place in a day like today where it's really hot is quite difficult also. So Paul, I've got a few questions here for you already. So there's a question here about whether leisure centres just attract the quote already healthy market. So when you see adverts for leisure centres and for gyms and things, it's usually people who look like they are pretty physically active. So what would your response to that be?
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. Yeah, there is some validity in the question, of course, and I think the knack and the obligation perhaps for the sector is how do we make it more appealing to this wider audience. When I think back to the comment I made earlier on that say 20-25% of people are regularly physically active, what that is saying is the majority of people aren't. And I think there's some great interventions going on about, particularly around the space of getting people who have been, perhaps when they're in their school age years, and perhaps through university or whatever, and then they get into midlife and they stop doing physical activity. So there's a lot of work around that space in particular, because that's a much easier audience to get back rather than getting those who have never participated. That's a much more difficult space to move into. So I think that part of it is around this mix of facility that we're getting. Part of it is about relevance, and that's relevance of activity, relevance of location, relevance of access. But it's also about just ensuring that we're using the right messaging as well. And credit to Sport England, they ran a very good campaign a couple of years ago, This Girl Can, which was about engaging with female potential participants, because there was a lot of concern about body image and this sort of thing. So there's a whole series of elements that need to come together to make it that we're not just providing a nice place for the people who don't want to pay 80 quid to use a premium health club can go and pay 30 or 40 quid. So we're not subsidizing that market. We actually want to make a difference into those parts of the community.
No, I think those are incredibly important points. And I mean, even in the community of people who exercise a lot, the emphasis of just the benefit of just moving and just, you know, being active. And certainly across a lot of the councils that we've worked with, that message is really hitting home, because it's not just, as I think you've said to me, it's not just, you know, badminton courts, it's other things that actually are relevant as well to the sort of lives we lead at the minute. So another question coming from a different angle, but to do with leisure centres again, how can they help grow a skills economy? Because obviously part of the levelling up agenda is increasing the skilled pool of workers in a particular area. So how could leisure centres help that?
Yeah, I think the real opportunity for our sector is around the relationship with the health providers. When I first came into this industry 30-something years ago, there was much excitement about something called GP referral, and this was the new big show in town, and it got delivered with mixed success. And part of that was that we as leisure providers were not speaking the language of clinicians and prescribers, and they worked very much on an evidence-based approach, and we weren't speaking that language. And we've got slightly better at it, but when you think about all those areas where physical activity can make a difference, and a very topical one at the moment is around dementia and how physical activity has a very positive impact on slowing, reducing, question mark depending on the research you read, preventing dementia. But we need to ensure we've got a workforce that knows what the right interventions are. So I think that whole space around the upskilling of the leisure providers and getting the language right, getting the skill set right, getting the qualifications right is going to be really important. So I see that as the big space. And my advert for the Institute, I would point people to look at the Chartered Institute. There's some very good stuff around that, and how we can look at that as a sector.
Great, thank you. I'm just going to pick up a couple of quick questions in the chat. There's a question about will there be second round funding windows and deadlines. So the UK Shared Prosperity Fund is a one-off. It's not a bid because it's not competitive, but it's a one-off activity councils have to go through to get their funding for the next 3 years. Once they get that funding, they will have had to have specified particular interventions, but there's quite a lot of flexibility over how those interventions will be undertaken. So for the UK Shared Prosperity Fund, no. For the Community Ownership Fund, absolutely yes. I think the plan is to have 3 windows a year for a couple of years. So there will be lots of opportunities. So that current deadline of the 19th of August is only the end of what's the second window. Actually, there was a window last year, so they are planning to run a lot more windows there. On the Levelling Up Fund, the simple answer is I don't know. So they gave out in round 1, they gave out 1.7 of the 4.8 that left over 3. So if they're going to give out all of it in round 2, which is the current round, then I guess they won't have any money for a third round. But if they give out half of it, then they will probably have a further round. But unfortunately, they haven't given any commitment or indication. And I mean, I guess that will be dependent on the quality of bids which come in this round 2. So not sure about that. So Community Ownership Fund, absolutely yes. UK Shared Prosperity Fund, no. And the Levelling Up Fund, potentially. There's a question also about part of the Levelling Up Fund, what kinds of things would come under cultural investment. So what projects I've worked on are on library refurbishments and arts centre refurbishments, investing in the kind of refurbishment of local cultural iconic displays, that type of thing. So there's quite a wide range of things that you can look at there, and the Levelling Up Fund prospectus is quite helpful in terms of outlining those things. But certainly I've been involved in at least a couple of library investments. So Paul, as I mentioned at the top, physical activity and well-being seems to be the bridge between the Levelling Up agenda and the health and care reforms. So are you finding that the health and care sector are also interested in physical activity provision in the area? And by that I mean I'm sure they're interested, but are they actively engaging with people like yourselves who can make it happen?
Yeah, I think that's a very fair comment. But yes, they are. I think potentially the biggest challenge is the timescales different sectors of the public service work at, and the different routes you need to go through. So with projects we're looking at with some of the education providers, for example, depending on the status of them, can often affect their decision making. And I think that's been very much the case historically with health, that we've looked at a number of projects over the years with health involvement, but actually because a local authority might be ready to pull the trigger on a scheme in 18 months, the decision making perhaps for the health providers might not allow for that. That doesn't make it something that can't then be delivered. It's then about how do we deliver a facility within that 18-month timescale, which can then have the bolt-on to integrate the health element as that funding comes on stream. So I think it needs a slightly creative eye as to how to bring this all together. But there's certainly been that involvement, and particularly around when we're doing remodeling of facilities. We're working with one particular client, Abbeycroft Leisure, which is one of the leisure trusts, in Suffolk, and they've got a very strong relationship with their local health providers, and they deliver a lot of integrated services. And so when we've remodeled a number of their facilities, we've really embedded to clinical level of facilities the health requirements within that. So I think that really shows the art of the possible, which I think is to some extent what the sector needs to understand, that you can do this. It doesn't have to be about building a brand new leisure centre with a doctor's surgery as part of it. There are other ways of doing this and getting health provision into the heart of the community.
Yeah, see, this is an area of great interest to me. So I think a lot of people on the call will know already that public health sits with councils. So that responsibility sits with councils, as does adult social care. And I think with the current reforms which are going on at the minute, which are putting in place integrated care systems across a wide area, then within that integrated care partnerships, there's a real opportunity at the minute for councils to take a lot more ownership of that public health role. And if you think about it, which public institution has the most impact and control over the wider determinants of health? I'm thinking things like housing, skills, what we're talking about, the provision of physical activity facilities. It's councils, it's not the acute trust. So I think there's a real opportunity here, and the world seems to be becoming much more aware of those wider determinants of health, and that's creating more of the bridge between all the stuff that councils are doing, including the physical activity support and the health sector, and it's forcing them to work much more closely together, I think, and I hope.
An interesting throwaway comment I had in a conversation with the health providers and local authority trust previously is that what is seen as a small amount of money to the health providers can sometimes be quite a significant amount of money to the leisure provider, and it can unlock the opportunity to do some really, really meaningful interventions at that leisure facility level, because this small amount of money is perceived by the health provider does allow that upskilling for the training to make sure you've got the people who can deliver the interventions and create the space, because very often these interventions are delivered at times what we traditionally call off-peak times in the leisure facility. So there's space, there's capacity. So what's the bit that's missing is the skills gap. So this joins together ever so neatly. And what I would say for those who have a role in influencing the health providers, what may seem like not very much money in compared to, as you described, an acute approach to health, can actually be the whole difference between being able to deliver something meaningful in the community and not.
Yeah. So I've got one more question on the chat here. So if you do have a question, make sure you get it in there. Otherwise, I will let everybody go a little bit earlier. There's a comment here about the Shared Prosperity Fund being limited amount to smaller authorities. It certainly is. And the example given here is 1.5 million. I'm certainly working with an authority that's only 1.2 million. So that's small amounts. And I will get to your question in the middle, but the final comment on this question is, it seems like feasibility funds might be able to help from the UK Shared Prosperity Fund, and then capital investments from the Levelling Up Fund. Absolutely, yes. Although, I say yes, but actually the feasibility money for the UK Shared Prosperity Fund should really be used to test the feasibility of revenue programs that maybe have a bit of capital, but so I'm not sure that works, but if the questioner wants to get in touch with me directly, we can have a chat about that. And then the middle bit of this question is one for you, Paul. So huge challenges around energy consumption that may force the closure of swimming pools. How can we transform our facilities to enable good provision of swimming at lower costs and lower carbon and energy consumption? That's the key question in all of this, probably.
I'm shuffling in my seat, Andrew.
Yeah.
And the reality is we don't have the magic bullet as we stand. One of the paradoxes when we've delivered about 15 million of the Salix PSDS schemes in terms of carbon reduction. And one of the early but difficult conversations we have with our clients is these interventions don't reduce your energy costs, they reduce the carbon output. So we have this very real dilemma. And just with the increase in tariffs that we've all experienced over the last 9 months, as I was saying, the sort of £40,000 per facility extra cost. Is the answer just to lump it on and charge the customer a bit more? Well, we start creating an even greater divide then. So I'm rather embarrassed to say I don't have the answer. What I can say is that as we're looking at the facilities of the future, we are looking at more energy efficient facilities, which will also be of benefit in terms of carbon reduction. But it's a very complicated space that we move in. I think to some extent the sector is looking to see what happens with energy costs, because I think the expectation is we're going to have quite a jump come October. What happens in the sort of period after that is clearly going to be very influenced by what's happening outside of the UK. And once it gets to a stable position, I think we're in a much better position to gauge it. The challenge we have is in the here and now, it's a real struggle. And I think we are going to see closures of facilities. I think it will be an easy win to close those facilities which are underperforming. The great concern I have is that, going back to my earlier point, if those are in areas of deprivation where they could and should have the greatest impact, we lose that asset. And I think once it goes, it may be very difficult to get it back again.
I think your point there about that being the easy win, and it's, a win in terms of the budget maybe for 1 year, but then all the unintended consequences of that come through. I mean, in the past, we've seen exactly the same thing with libraries, where the easy thing to do is to close it. The really innovative councils have explored things like community ownership, and some of those libraries are now really thriving and doing exactly what they're there to do. So I wouldn't ignore the potential of the community ownership fund as well in this, because whilst it's a different challenge to run a leisure centre than it is to run a library, there are skilled staff out there who could do it, and there are examples of it. So there are ways forward, but there is no magic solution, as Paul said, to it. But that does not mean we don't need to keep looking and keep trying and to squeeze every little last drop of value we can get out of those assets and make sure that they stay open where possible. So I am going to wrap us up a little bit early there, Paul. And I just want to say a huge thank you for your time. And for everybody watching, we will send out the slides. We will send a recording in the next few days, and you can feel free to share that with any colleagues, or if you really want to, you can watch it again, but I suspect not. But Paul, thank you.
Thanks, Andrew.
Thanks, everybody. Goodbye.